had inmates that would speak with me, a 25-year-old inmate doing 30 years for a crack cocaine distribution, and you're trying to encourage them to get their GED, and they would look you straight in the face and go, "Boss, this is a life sentence for me. I'm 25 years old. I'm going to be in my 50s when I get released. I really don't care about getting my GED, and I
Yeah.
really don't care about your measly 47 days of good time either."
Hey, everybody. Pete Bludworth with Corrections Unfiltered, podcast where corrections meets conversation, and that's exactly what we're going to do today. Today's podcast is episode 2 of our prison reform series. We're going to talk about some of the root causes that we identified in episode 1. We're going to talk about the Sentence Reform Act's tough on crime laws and how did all that play out through time. So until we understand the root causes, then we will begin to build up on what our corrective actions are going to be. Today we have John Vanyur, storied career in corrections, went through the ranks in the Bureau of Prisons, and actually became an assistant director. He's done a lot for corrections even after he retired. So let's get in this conversation with John. But again, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. We do appreciate your support. Well, hey, everybody, I am back and I am blessed to have John Vanyur. Like I said, John Vanyur has a very storied career with corrections. So hello, John. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Great. Thanks, Pete. It's great to talk to you again. And I appreciate you keeping corrections in the forefront with the
We're doing
podcast and the work that you do.
we're doing the best that we can, sir, and thank you for your support. Could you give us a quick bio on your history?
Sure. And what's interesting is the topics we're going to talk about today in terms of the expansion of prison populations is not a theoretical for me. It occurred exactly during the timing of my career. So I began in the Bureau of Prisons in 1979 as a summer intern in the old Bureau when the populations were low. Um, and then retired in the 2000s when the populations were over 200,000. We'll talk more about that. I started my career in research. I have a PhD in psychology, uh, and then spent a lot of my career in human resources and staff training. I was the staff training director for the Bureau, the warden of a facility in Butner, North Carolina, and a high-rise jail in Philly, and then eventually was the assistant director of Correctional Programs Division in the Bureau. So I had oversight to all the operations and security for the Bureau. And then after I retired, I became a consultant and had my own firm and worked for a number of private corporations and state agencies.
That's a great career, sir. I want to thank you because I was in the Bureau of Prisons during your tenure and you did many great things for us. And I want to say thank you for the fact that you've done that for so many of the BOP employees. So thank you for your career.
Great. Thank you, Pete.
So we were talking about in the episode 1, we talked about some of the root causes that we believe has put corrections in the situation that it's in. And you brought up some very interesting points in the conversation that you and I had. You want to go ahead and start taking us down that road of how things began to change when there were certain laws put in place?
Absolutely. So just to give you a couple sort of background pieces, most of what we're going to talk about today deals with the federal system and the Bureau of Prisons. Um, I'll talk about later. The changes in the Bureau began to be reflected in many of the state systems. One of the acts we'll talk about, the states were actually financially incentivized to mimic the sentencing structure of the federal prisons. So even though what we're going to talk about is primarily a federal experience, it really has deep roots and translated over to the state systems. The one thing about the federal prison system that you have to keep in mind is it was never built to be a national system. It was never built to be the largest prison system in the country. It was a small niche system that was created in the 30s. It had a very specific population. It was typically white collar offenders, wire
Mhm.
fraud, bank fraud, tax evasion. That's the club fed image we have of the Bureau of Prisons from the 60s and 70s. And then specific federal crimes like bank robbery. But it wasn't built to be a large scale system full of violent offenders. That just wasn't part of what the mission was. And that reflected in the population. So the population of the Bureau of Prisons in 1940 was around 24,000. And the
Mhm.
population of the Bureau of Prisons in 1980 was 24,000. So 40 years of, a little ups and downs, but primarily consistent population. And then in 1984, everything began to change. And that's what
Well,
I want
what?
to talk about.
Yeah, what caused
Yeah.
that change?
So keep in mind that prison populations are driven by two major factors. How many people are coming in the front door meaning arrest, prosecution, sentencing, and how many people are going out the back door through release and sentence length. And both of those factors were significantly impacted in the 80s and early 90s. We'll start with the sentencing piece.
Okay.
In 1984, we have the Sentencing Reform Act. In 1986, the Drug Abuse Act. And it dramatically changed the back door of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The first thing that the Sentencing Reform Act did is it abolished parole. So there was no more release of federal inmates through a parole mechanism prior to the end of their sentence. The guys that were sentenced before the act were grandfathered in. They still had parole eligibility, but they eventually, weeded themselves out of the system. But no one
Right.
from that date on was received parole. You were going to do your entire sentence for the most part. And parole was replaced with supervised release so that you got a term of release after your sentence, but that didn't change your sentence. Where parole you got in lieu of your sentence, this was post sentence supervision that was done by the United States Probation Office. It also created a sentencing commission and specific determinate sentencing with mandatory minimums. And what I mean by that is the acts took away any discretion that the judges had, or almost all the discretion. And it became very mathematical. So if you were arrested, for example, with 200 grams of crack cocaine, there was literally a chart that said 200 grams of crack cocaine translates to 30 years of federal prison time. These were very specific guidelines that were laid out. And the judge could make minor adjustments up or down from the guidelines, but the guardrails on those judges was very strict. So between the mandatory minimum sentences, the determinant sentences, and the lack of parole, you were going to do roughly 85% of your time once you got sentenced, at least 85%.
Yeah.
And that's assuming you earned the good time that you could have gotten, which was technically 54 days a year. But in the legislation, they changed the calculation of good time to figure it on the time served, not the time sentenced. It's getting a little technical here, but it
Yeah, it is.
reduced your good time from basically 54 days a year to 47 days a year. So we
And that
have this
adds up over
massive
years.
change in the back door and how long people are going to spend their time in prison. Let me move over to the front end now, because while that's going on and those significant changes are going on, there's also what I call the federalization of state crimes. Crimes and inmates that typically would have gone to a state system began pouring into the federal system. And some of this was absolutely policy driven, some of it legislative. So in the Violent Crime Act, we have over 50 new criminal offenses that become federal offenses now. Gang membership, immigration issues, sex offenses, conspiracy issues. These were federalized by law. They became federal crimes. And what happened even more than that was we had the creation of these task forces where you had federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies all teaming together, mainly in urban areas, to coordinate their efforts to make arrests. So you had, for example, in 1980s, you had the HIDTA, high intensity drug trafficking task forces that the DEA controlled. In the 90s, you had the Safe Streets task forces that the FBI primarily did. And there were others too. The marshals had fugitive task force and so forth. And what happened is when they arrest people on a task force, any of those jurisdictions, feds, state, and local, have dibs. What had happened is because the feds had such strict sentencing, the states were giving the cases to the feds that they normally would have taken, knowing that the inmate would get a longer sentence, and bluntly knowing that the feds would pay the freight for his incarceration over the state. So you have a massive influx of inmates coming in, and then you have the back end getting longer and longer in sentencing and the release mechanisms getting smaller and smaller. And that caused the population to balloon. It doubled by the time from 1980 to 1990. It doubled again in the 90s. and then eventually went from when I started 24,000 to over 210,000 in just my career path. So think about that. From 24 facilities to 120 facilities, just an incredible expansion.
If you don't mind, I want to go back into that also and those changes and how they affect, facilities and how they operated. So now you have inmates with the parole system were given the benefit of if you behave well in the prison and you do voluntary type things like you get a job, you might not have been mandated to get an education, but you get an education. You're not mandated by courts to participate in programming, but you do. And those were all things that they added that together. So when they met with the parole board, they could get a significant amount of time cut.
Right.
It was all at the decision of the parole board. It wasn't automatic, so they had to make their case. Do you feel that that was an impact on management of prisons?
Absolutely. And particularly for the federal system on a couple different levels. First of all, like you said, this huge carrot of parole is gone.
Yeah,
And we've reduced the good time. And by the way, we've added up a massive determinate sentencing where you're going to serve 85% of your sentence. I mean, I had inmates that would speak with me, a 25-year-old inmate doing 30 years for a crack cocaine distribution, and you're trying to encourage them to get their GED,
mhm,
and they would look you straight in the face and go, "Boss, this is a life sentence for me. I'm 25 years old. I'm going to be in my 50s when I get released. I really don't care about getting my GED. And I
yeah,
really don't care about your measly 47 days of good time either. I'm going to do my time the way I want to do my time." And
right,
it's hard to argue with that. The other problem from the inmate management perspective is because of this quote federalization of crime, we began to get a different type of client in the Bureau
right,
of Prisons. And if you look at the Bureau of Prisons population today, it's 40% drug offenders, 15% weapons offenses, and 19% sex offenders. I don't hear bank robbery and white collar in any of those numbers. These are typically state kind of guys. And so they tend to be more violent and more disruptive than the typical population we had. I mean, we had, certain old school gang prison gang guys and so forth. But we weren't used to the street gangs, and we weren't used to the guys that were this violent. It's particularly at a young age. That wasn't the population we dealt with. So we have the combination of long sentences, no carrot for parole, and a different type of population coming into our system, which made the management difficult. And then the crowding caused its own problems. You had massive inmate idleness. When I was at Butner, we went from double bunk to triple bunk to quadruple bunked in a
wow,
handful of years. There's not enough work to keep those guys busy. And not only that, because we had a building boom to try to keep up with the population, most of the facilities were brand new. So they didn't need any
yeah,
maintenance. They didn't need to be painted like an old school
okay.
Leavenworth or something like that. So now you've got guys sitting around idle, and that always causes management problems.
Well, not only did you have that absolutely correct, and I now just say that the new prisons, there's less maintenance to be done, less opportunity to get people out and doing things. But you also, because I activated the facility, you also have more than or right around 50% of your staff are brand new to corrections from the local area, and corrections wasn't a part of their thought pattern for a career. And so now you have an educated population of inmates on how to be a convict, and now you have newer staff, and also because of that expansion, like you said, 24 prisons to 122 in a 40-year period of time, you have new leadership, and not to say bad, but inexperienced leadership. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, you think about going from 24 to 120 prisons, even in 15, 20 years. That's not that long of a period of time to develop the
No.
hundreds of mid managers and executives that need to be developed in a good organization. So, the Bureau of Prisons was a fairly small agency when I got there. You knew pretty much all the wardens, and it took them years to get to the jobs that they got, where we had to accelerate that process dramatically and put people through chairs much quicker than we would have in a typical succession planning thing. And the other problem was, Pete, budgets got to be very difficult.
Mhm.
because the appropriations process, and not to get too wonky here, lags behind reality. It takes you a couple years to get your requests for budgets through the Congress. Meanwhile, your population's continuing to grow without that
Yeah.
money. So budget cuts became. Well, what's the first thing that gets cut in a prison budget? I can tell you two things get cut immediately: non mandatory staff training and inmate programming, because they don't affect the safety, they don't affect the security. They're easy things to cut. But the problem when you eliminate non-mandatory staff training in that is a lot of management and leadership development training.
Yeah.
That's really an investment for the future. You don't see the payoff for years. And that got cut as the 90s went on. Because I used to be one of my jobs, I was the chief of management development for the Bureau of Prisons. I was my responsibility to develop programs and succession plans for the agency. That went by the wayside when the money got tight, as did much inmate programming. So that added, exacerbated the problem of the rapid increase in leadership chairs. In the Violent Crime Control Act, there was over $9 billion in that act to build prisons for states, not the feds. It was a federal budget, but there was a state prison construction grant given to states who would change their sentencing structure to mimic the Bureau
Oh,
of Prisons, to have at least 85% of your sentence served. So think about that.
yeah.
And 50% of the states, half the states, got that grant money and changed their sentencing structure to match what the feds were doing. So the states really began to mimic a lot of what the BOP was doing. And they went through massive expansions. You can look at the population of TDCJ or California or many of the other states. Their population charts look a lot like the BOP did in the 90s.
Okay. How does it affect the probation, parole, going supervised release? How is that back end of that affected?
Um, Significantly, as we talked about it, with the abolition of parole and the shift to supervised release, supervised release almost became a mandatory part of your sentence. If you look at the numbers, it found 85% of inmates were under supervised release. And those supervised release conditions became very strict. And almost you'll see the term if you see people that are critical of what happened, then almost a
Mhm.
tripwire, that you'll see that term, to have people recidivate, violate their supervised release and come back in the system. And we saw that. Particularly, I was at a low security prison. A significant population in that low security prison were all supervised release violators. A
Okay.
lot of them were technical violations. It got to be a point where over 25% of the violators that were coming back to the Bureau of Prisons were technical violations. They weren't even
Yeah.
crimes being committed. So you know, what the probation office was doing in terms of how strict they were managing their inmates, I don't have any observation to that. The probation office does an outstanding job on what they're doing.
They do.
But one of the problems that I don't think most people understand with probation is that there's a major structural problem with release and the Bureau. Bear with me on this sort of
Yeah.
government stuff. So the United States Parole Commission was part of the United States Department of Justice. The Bureau of Prisons and the Parole Commission, in fact, they used to be in our building, reported to the same person in the United States Department of Justice. So there was a chain of command. There was a link between the two. The United States Probation Office does not work for the Department of Justice, and they don't even work for the executive branch of the government.
Huh.
They work for the court system. So there is no organizational tie. There is no chain of command link in any org chart between the Bureau
Yeah.
of Prisons and the people controlling the release of inmates, which would be unheard of in a state system. There would be either the director of corrections or someone in a public safety chair would have oversight of both, so that you have a smooth transition from hopefully pretrial detention, incarceration, release, that information flow, the programming, everything would flow. The other problem is the BOP is a national system. It doesn't have a presence in communities. and in major urban areas. So let me just give you an example. And I know you worked in Montana for a little bit. If you're a case manager in Montana, you know how to get that inmate a driver's license, housing, mental health care, employment, because you have contacts with the state agencies that control those services. If you're a Bureau of Prisons case manager, your inmates are from 25 different states and you have no contact with those state agencies that control those services. So you're not really going to be able to develop a credible release
Yeah.
plan and make the contacts that that offender needs before he gets released. So that handoff is going to go completely to the back end of the system and sort
Mhm.
of out of our control and out of our sight, meaning out of the correction site. And to me, that's a structural issue that really causes problems on release. I just was just reading yesterday that um, the Sentencing Commission is making some significant changes as of
Mm.
2025 in supervised release to make it more individually tailored to who gets supervised release and under what conditions, and try to significantly reduce the technical violations. So they clearly have some insight into their own
Great.
behavior that they need to make some changes. So I think it's an encouragement. I think we need to take a business approach to sentencing and look at what the financial payoff is for certain sentences. And I don't want to get too academic here, but no business would not put money into something unless they understood what the return on investment was, what the ROI is. But we don't
Mhm.
do that. So we don't know that if we sentence somebody to 10 years, whether we'll get the same payoff than if we sentence them to 20 years.
Okay.
And if it's the same payoff, meaning we've accomplished our goals of punishment, deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation in 10 years, we just wasted $600,000, $60,000 a year times the 10 years, times hundreds of thousands of inmates. So I think we need to get out of the philosophical arguments in this arena and the political arguments and start looking at business arguments of how we should sentence, what programs we should invest in that have the biggest payoff, the ROI to reduce recidivism. And if we take that approach, I think we'll solve things without devolving into whether this is a liberal or conservative argument.
So, sir, now that we're moving forward with our series, and this one was to tackle those root causes, what suggestions would you have for us moving forward in this conversation?
It would be interesting, I think, to get some state perspective. A little bit outside the federal perspective, though. I said that, as I mentioned, there's a bleed over, but
Hmm.
particularly states like Texas and California and New York that have very large systems. And I also think, and I know you looked a little bit, and this is a little bit beyond corrections, but when you talked to Percy Pitzer a little bit, I know, and one an earlier one is start thinking about outside of corrections, how we can reduce the future prison population through actions and interventions earlier before incarceration. Of course, Percy has the foundation where he deals with children of incarcerated felons, but there's a lot of work on that end that corrections people don't really have a piece in, but certainly should have a voice in. And one of the things I think it'd be worth talking about with someone else is this issue of accountability in corrections. And what I mean is, corrections is not accountable for the product they produce. I was never held accountable for how good the inmates were upon release that went through my custody. The Bureau of Prisons was never held accountable for its recidivism rates. But that's the bottom line in what the product we're producing. So it would be interesting to talk to people that sort of think through they're more of an academic look at how we hold systems accountable, how we can hold managers accountable for the product that
Okay.
they're producing, rather than just look at how many escapes I had, how many homicides, or even how many hours of program participation. What's the net result of what corrections is producing?
That's a great way to look at it, and that's an interesting perspective. Thank you for sharing that, and I really do appreciate the fact that you've come on this Corrections Unfiltered episode and kind of helped us work our way through that root cause. I think we have a better foundation from which to move forward on, and sir, we've talked about this. Many years ago, you taught a class. The things that you taught in that class, I still use today in corrections. So, from me personally, I want to say thank you for coming on this podcast and having this conversation. You are a great person for me to have met in my career, and I truly appreciate that. So, I want to thank you, and also everybody, please like and subscribe to this. Please leave some comments. You have an opportunity now to voice what you think. What are your perspectives on it? Mr. Vanyur has done a great job in laying out the foundation of what took place, what happened, and where we're at, and how we can start looking at moving forward. So, Mr. Vanyur, thank you again, sir. Thank you so much.
Great to see you again.